Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, where we talk about politics, the culture war, and anything else that comes up. And we have another cracking guest, comedian, writer, crypto expert, super funny, super smart, and he has one of the best Substacks in all the land. It's your friend of mine, Mr. Dominic Frisby. Thanks for doing the show, mate.
Thank you very much for having me, Nick. I hope you're well.
I'm very well. How are you? You look good. Have you just got back from Miami?
I've just gone back from Miami. I was just at a Bitcoin conference out there, and I had a great time. I had dinner at Michael Saylor's house. Do you know who Michael Saylor is?
No, but I can tell it's impressive.
Yeah, he's like the sort of number one kind of Bitcoin guru. And he just had this beautiful house in Miami Beach. So I had dinner there with him and Robert Kennedy.
Wow.
Which isn't bad. And Robert Kennedy made all these announcements about, pro-crypto legislation, pro-Bitcoin legislation. He was talking about if he wins... I think he was even talking about taxes becoming payable in Bitcoin. In other words, making it legal tender. And he was going on and on about the relationship between fiat money and war, which is something that I've only ever heard Ron Paul talk about in terms of American politicians. And so I just thought I was listening to another Ron Paul, and not to get my hopes up in case, because there's no way the military industrial complex will allow him to be elected, and he's too much of a conspiracy theorist and all that kind of thing. But talking to a few people there, they said, no, it's commonly recognized in the Democrat Party that he can beat Trump, whereas Biden v. Trump is a draw. And so the Republicans don't want him and the Democrats do want him. And this is how perverse American politics, or politics generally, is that the things he stands for are pretty Republican things, sound money, less war, that kind of thing. And so in a way, you would think that Republicans would want him, but they don't. He'll definitely win the Libertarian vote if he manages to stand.
Wow, very interesting.
I asked him and I said, he thinks he's going to win. I mean, he's not going to say anything else because he's a salesman, he's selling himself, but he was pretty sure he's going to win, and they'll find a way to get rid of Biden and let him stand. He's got that powerful family name, that's for sure.
I was going to say, he's got the brand. Did you hear that rumor at one point that he could be Trump's VP? I mean, was that just sort of crazy talk?
The problem with Trump is, I think he's a personality politician. You wonder kind of, his policies aren't. He doesn't come from a sort of political philosophy. His policies aren't that clear. And for example, when he was going to stand down, I was really hoping he'd give Edward Snowden a pardon, and he'd give Assange a pardon, and he didn't. And I thought that was a real opportunity missed. But if he was a really principled kind of libertarian guy, and the libertarians like him because he winds up all the right people, and he is unpredictable. So I'm pretty sure, for example, Putin wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if Trump was in power. But nevertheless, he's not like, he likes low interest rates. He likes easy money. He likes economic booms. Even if they're crack up fake booms. So, he's a personality politician in my view, rather than a sort of, stands for a particular philosophy. I think his philosophy is Donald Trump.
Yeah, I agree with that. But he has annoyed some libertarians because they see him as sort of corporatist. Because libertarians can be... So would you consider yourself, just quickly, a libertarian? Is that fair to say?
Oh, hardcore.
Hardcore libertarian. Okay, because there's different types. There's the minarchist one. There's different subsets that I semi-understand and forgotten.
There are definitely...
Should have checked.
A minarchist is somebody who believes in minimum state. But I would go as far as to call myself an anarchist, which is somebody who believes in no state. My first book was called Life After the State. And there's a new thing, I don't know if you've heard of them, called anarcho-capitalists. So that would be anarchists and capitalists, shortened to ANCAP. And so one of my songs is called Show Me the Way to ANCAPistan.
That's so on brand. All right. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, because I was going to ask you one question I was thinking about asking, and young Rory, who works on our clips and sometimes appears on the show, also wanted to ask, but I'm also have to caveat it in case I seem dumb, which is I wanted to ask, what would a libertarian Britain or a libertarian state look like? But I wanted to caveat it that I understand that when Michael Malice is asked this question about anarchism, he always says it's not a place, it's a relationship between people. But I'm going to ask the question anyway, and you can tell me if it's stupid. So what would your libertarian state look like?
Well, one of the catchphrases of hardcore libertarians, they're big believers in free movement, And I wrote the Libertarian National Anthem, which no doubt you play every night as you switch off your computer.
I pledge allegiance to it.
But one of the things I say in the National Anthem is free speech, free movement, free minds, and free choice. And libertarians always argue for free movement, but they also argue for no welfare state. And you can't have free movement and a welfare state. The two are incompatible. But you can have free movement and no welfare state, because then the incentive to move isn't quite the same, and then it becomes the responsibility of local people to manage who comes in and out of their area, because property is privately owned rather than state owned. But what would a libertarian Britain look like? The closest analogy I can think of, and there are loads of flaws in this argument, so if anyone really righteous is listening to this, but I always, when I did my Dominic Frisby financial game show, one of the rounds in the quiz was that you had to answer the question, and the right answer was my opinion. And so the question here is, which is preferable, a united Britain or a confederation of smaller city-states along the lines of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy? And the correct answer is, of course, a confederation of smaller city-states along the lines of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. So in my sort of libertarian ideal, we would have Cornwall and Wessex and Kent and Sussex and Mercia and Northumbria and so on. And Ireland would be, the 4 counties, or even the 5 counties if you're really good on your Irish history. There's a central county. And similarly, Scotland would break up into areas and Wales would break up. So it would be much more of a hodgepodge, and the concept of Britain and a united kingdom wouldn't exist.
Wow. Well, yeah, I'm definitely up for that. I like it because it sounds reactionary, but it just I want to go back to I want.
There's no chance of it happening. I mean, it's
obviously
just it's stupid late night pub talk.
Yeah. I'd go back to just Cumbria, although Cumbria is a recent name, so I'd go back to Westmoreland or whatever. But yeah,
I think you'd be part of Northumbria, even though you're on the other side of the. Would that be the Pennines up there?
We could discuss that. I mean, we could work that out. I mean, I'm not sure about being tied in with them.
Nick, if you're standing for an independent Cumbria and you're bidding to be the first king of the independent Cumbrian nation, you have my vote.
Thanks, mate. I've considered trying to run up there.
I'm going to be king of Dumnonia or Cerno, which would be Cornwall. So I can see a very useful, West Coast alliance forming.
Game of Thrones stuff. Yeah, I mean, I have been approached by certain political parties who said I could stand, but they're not necessarily the ones I want to stand for. But I've thought about it. You know what I mean? With my likability and massive public profile. But maybe you could be the policy guy behind the scenes.
As someone who became a potential Brexit Party MEP for a week, I can tell you that it is not worth the aggro. In the week that, I wasn't going to do it, and then I thought it would get me a bit of publicity before Edinburgh, so I said, okay, I'm standing for the Brexit Party. And there were people, can I swear?
You can. I mean, YouTube don't love it, but hey, you're a libertarian.
So people were writing, all over my Edinburgh posters, people were writing UKIP, C-U-N-T. They started saying horrible things about my kids. Even Comedy Unleashed, who were determined to be apolitical, and I was the main resident host, the founding resident host of Comedy Unleashed. They sacked me. They said, because we don't want any allegiance with any political party. So all these things happened in the space of a week. I just took so much abuse, and I'm quite a thin-skinned guy. I'm a thin-skinned artist, and to be a politician, you got to have thick skin. So I don't.
Hang on, what did Comedy Unleashed sack you from? You mean from being a host of the?
Yeah.
Really?
They didn't want anyone. Andrew Doyle didn't want anyone with any allegiance to any political party. Remember, this is a while ago. This was 2018, and I think he was trying to make Comedy Unleashed apolitical.
Wow.
Maybe it was 2019. I don't remember, but I lost my job briefly. But what happened? What I'd actually, to be clear, what had happened is I had already stood down, and then Andy Shaw phoned me up and said, "Look, you can't be the Brexit Party guy in the Comedy Unleashed, so we're gonna have to let you go." And then, because I'd already resigned, from the Brexit Party, I was then able to say it's not an issue because I've already resigned, and Andy Shaw was fine about that. So that's slightly inaccurate to say I got the sack. They phoned me up to give me the sack, but the change of circumstances
You unsacked yourself.
meant
All
that
right.
I was reinstated.
Well, we love Andrew Doyle and Andy Shaw, but Andrew's a bit of a lefty, so you know what I mean. They make these mistakes. I mean, maybe they wouldn't even do it now. But I love that you joined the Brexit Party to give yourself some publicity for the Edinburgh Festival, thinking this will go well in the comedy industry, where anyone to the right of Stalin is despised.
Yeah, well, my show was libertarian love songs, so I thought it would appeal to the libertarian contingent.
Libertarians seem more cuddly, though, don't they?
There are very few libertarians in Edinburgh.
Yeah, and they seem more cuddly and, like you say, kind of fantastical, and it won't happen. Whereas when you're like, hey, I'm mates with Farage, it's like, it's a little bit different. But
it's interesting, by the way, if you ask that question in Scotland, which is preferable, a United Kingdom or a confederation of smaller city-states, in Scotland, the libertarians will all say United Kingdom, because by being pro-United Kingdom, they're taking the anti-socialist, anti-Scottish independence stance. So it's quite interesting. So libertarians south of the border will be pro-Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, but north of the border, they're pro-union.
Interesting, yeah. Anything but SNP, I get it. Why do they struggle, libertarians? Because people kind of hate them a little bit. Like I remember seeing a Joe Rogan episode with Larry Sharpe, who, you know, pretty well-known libertarian in New York, and he was really harsh to him, and it was quite strange because Rogan is someone you think of as a sort of small L libertarian, you know, vague libertarian leanings. He was very harsh to them. And also, they don't get anywhere these days in mainstream politics. You know, the possible exception would be Thatcher's libertarian leanings. She had a Milton Friedman books. I don't know. I can ask you about that in a sec. But they seem to struggle a bit.
She was a big Hayek fan.
Yeah. But they seem to... Why do they struggle? And why are they sort of hated by the mainstream or struggle to make any headway?
I don't know. I think part of the reason is that you know, I get branded, well, we all do, but I was very early to this, to be branded far right. And I always used to say, how is somebody that believes in having as little state as possible far right? And I've had massive arguments with Hal Cruttenden about this, like endless. Hal and I've known Hal since I was 7 years old, so we're quite, you know, the first girl I ever got off with was at Hal's house. But Hal's just turned out to be this ridiculous lefty, and I'm, you know, somewhere else, but on the political compass. But this is an argument, you know, how, because far right in my head involves, you know, Mussolini or whatever, and massive government state action, and libertarians argue for as little state as possible and peaceful. You know, libertarians are very anti-war, pro-peace. And, you know, I think it's partly because, for some reason, the idea of left and right is just a false map. And you're familiar with the political compass, I'm sure. Yeah. And so that left-right, authoritarian, libertarian is actually a much more accurate measure of, you know, people's philosophy or their politics. But because, for example, Thatcher, who was sort of very much in the libertarian direction, certainly in her utterances, and Reagan, they would be in the bottom right quadrant, whereas Mussolini or whatever would be in the top right quadrant, authoritarian right. But that doesn't matter. If you're right, you're authoritarian. And then a lot of people, like the sort of UKIP, were campaigning for less government, and UKIP got conflated with, you know, the EDL and all those nationalist parties quite a bit. But because of anything to do with nationalism gets branded far right by the left, who like to smear their ideological enemies. You know, I've actually argued that I tried to have this argument. I used to write quite a bit for The Guardian, and I used to say to them, look, you're positioning yourself as authoritarian left, and you've got this wrong. You want to be down there in the sort of libertarian left quadrant, because, you know, that's where a lot of your sort of readers who read you, who are artists and so on, they don't realise it, but that's where they are on the compass. But no, The Guardian's gone for this much more authoritarian left stance. Anyway, but if you, in the Venn diagram, a lot of people who sympathise with libertarian values will also maybe be in that sort of Brexity, Thatchery spectrum as well, and so as a result, the two get, right and libertarian get conflated. There is crossover in the Venn diagram, but they're not one and the same.
No, exactly.
Corbyn and Gandhi and people like that would all be libertarian left.
Yeah, because Corbyn was against a lot of the COVID restrictions and so on.
Yeah.
The compass is useful. I actually come out incredibly just like very centre, just like a tiny bit to the right of centre. I admit it's moving slightly more authoritarian as I get older. It's creeping a little bit as the world gets more ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't like. I come out sort of slightly right and slightly libertarian, and I want to be bottom centre is where I would like to be, because that's the argument I make, is for bottom centre or maybe bottom centre right. But I actually come out, just slightly libertarian and slightly right wing. But the questions are so annoying.
Yeah, some people think the questions are rigged by lefties anyway, I've heard. I mean, that's the kind of thing we would say, but that's what I've heard.
I don't believe the person who wrote that political compass is left wing. I think
you think the questions are not that good.
Well, I just found them annoying because the answer was always more nuanced than they would let you have. But I think somebody who is trying to, I mean, that the purpose of that compass is to make the point that it's not just left and right; it's authoritarian and libertarian, and that changes the way the prism through which we see politics. And somebody who's trying to change the prism through which we see politics is, in my opinion, more likely to be libertarian than authoritarian. And so it wouldn't surprise me if it's somebody, a little bit in that bottom right quadrant who did that.
Yes. Since we're talking about this, do you have any thoughts on the sort of, at the time of recording, fairly topical division on the right following the NatCon conference, which I don't know if you went to. I went to the dinner, but I was too hungover to go to the main conference. But I very rarely drink. But I didn't go. I was too tired. And but it looked very interesting. The dinner was great. I mean, Douglas Murray spoke. Later, got called a fascist on Twitter. But the dinner was nice. Lots of interesting people there.
Was it like black tie?
It wasn't black tie. It was fairly chill. But it was obviously a beautiful venue, the Natural History Museum, who then later distanced themselves on Twitter. It was under that massive. I think it's a blue whale skeleton, and
they took the dollar. I know that room. It's a big room. It probably seats several hundred.
Yeah, it was a great event. There's loads of people there, and Murray spoke really well. And he was just that funny.
I once saw Jimmy Carr do a corporate gig in that room to like the British Entrepreneurs Society or something like that.
Wow!
And it was a masterclass in how to do a corporate gig.
Yeah. Well, this was a slightly different type of gig, but it's one of these things where the optics of it on Twitter. Of course, you've got the idiots on Twitter calling it fascist, which is very strange because it's founded by a Jewish person. But hey, why let facts get in the way? But the thing I wanted to ask you about was, and Lord Frost has written about this. There's this disagreement between the libertarian or Thatcherite side, at least, and this new side that's sort of more protectionist. And they're basically saying they're post-liberal. They're saying that. And they're post sort of libertarian economy, and they're saying that's not going to work. And they're going down more of a sort of Bannon path, Steve Bannon path of kind of economic nationalism. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on this sort of argument within the right about that.
I haven't followed it that closely. I've just become, when Brexit was going on and they were trying to undermine it, that was one of the most interested in politics I've ever been. And like every day I'd be, reading every utterance by anyone involved on Twitter, and reading all the journalism and so on. I got so involved, but I've just become so disillusioned with everything that's happened since maybe 2019. I mean, I saw it coming. I knew that when I didn't vote for Johnson in 2019. I didn't vote for anyone. I just spoilt my ballot paper, which is what I usually do. But I just knew that everyone was so happy when Johnson won, and they all thought we're going to get Brexit, and I just was like, no, you're not. And we're going to get a shrinking government and lower taxes and all the things that Liz Truss attempted to do. And I was like, no, you're not going to get that. And
I was going to ask about Truss. Oh, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so it's okay. So where do I stand on that argument is, like, my bottom principle is anything that delivers less government, less blob, lower taxes, etc., is the right path to choose. And like the problem with whatever it is, regulation, laws, whatever, they're easier to add to than to take away. And so the incremental effects over time, over decades, hundreds of years, is that we just have this bloated state that keeps getting added to rather than having it taken away. And I just don't think it can end, Nick. I think the only thing that can end it is the collapse of the currency, and with it, the collapse of the state. Otherwise, even like the only difference with Thatcher is that the state kept growing. It just didn't grow by as much as it had grown under the previous regime. It still was a lot bigger by the time she'd finished than when she began. And that was with her, Mrs., anti-government and small individual choice and all that. And I mean, if you just look at the tax code as a sort of symbol of excess regulation and excess government, the last time the tax code shrunk was Nigel Lawson in, I think, 1989. He removed a tax with every budget. And ever since then, it's grown, and it tripled in size under Gordon Brown. And then Osborne came to power, threatening to, with his Office of Tax Simplification, promising to simplify it. And even with his Office of Tax Simplification, it doubled again under his tenure. And then it just and I think it's not quite double from where Osborne stood down, but it's harder to double because it's so big. But the magnitude with which it's grown because of all the subsidies during COVID and everything, it's endless. And there's so many people sucking on the teat of it all. It's endless, I'm afraid, and I'm very disillusioned. And so I'm just taking the line of there's no point arguing about politics because you can't change anything. I'll write comic songs about it and satirical songs. But meanwhile, I just try and put my own house in order, and that's all that I can actually affect myself.
All right, fair enough. Pretty bleak, but I feel pretty bleak about the country as well. I mean, why did they get rid of Truss? Because was it if you talk to economists or people in the extended blob, they'll say, well, it was the liability-driven investments and it was going to tank the pensions market. I have a kind of vague understanding of these things. I have a kind of limited. If someone explains it to me for that night and I have to talk about it on telly, I can know it for about 3 hours and then I kind of forget it because I don't have a fundamental understanding. But what was the real reason in your opinion about Truss and Kwarteng?
Well, the first thing to note is that pension situation was not a creation of Liz Truss. It just came to a head under her tenure. That had been building for many years. And it might have been a storm in a teacup anyway. And, I mean, you just need to look at the hysteria around Braverman and her driving tickets that's going on at the minute to know that anything they can get you on, that the left can attack you on, they will. And, eventually they got rid of Boris, just relentless, no mercy, anything they can get you. And I think the mistake that Truss made was not sticking to her guns. And if you look at what happened in the bond market, the reason that Kwarteng was forced out was because of the spike in the bond market, because of spike in gilt yields. But what had happened, and the media did not broadcast this, and it's criminal. And the Bank of England, do you remember when the Bank of England sold the British gold at the bottom of the market under Gordon Brown's instruction in 1999? They sold 2/3 of British gold. Did you know that?
No, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, so at the bottom, it's known in the gold market as Brown's bottom. And it was a 20-year generational low in the market. It was the single worst trade in history, almost. And Gordon Brown, when he had no need to do so, sold 2/3 of British gold at the bottom of the market at $250 an ounce, give or take. And the reason that it was the bottom of the market is that the bank, because of its commitment to transparency or whatever, broadcast before it was selling the gold that it was going to sell the gold on these dates. So all the buyers in the gold market knew this extraordinary amount of gold was about to come on the market, and they just stood back and said there's no point buying because we're about to have this dumping of gold on the market. And so it hit the low, and it was like, it was the lowest price for gold since like 1978 or something. It was that bad. So in 40 or 50 years now, it's the all-time low. Now, what happened with bonds, you may remember that with quantitative easing, and they're actually called gilts in the UK, but with quantitative easing, and then all the money that got printed during COVID, the Bank of England printed money, and with that money, it went and bought government debt. It bought gilts. And so that enabled the government to borrow at low rates, and that gave the government lots of money to spend. And then because of inflation and everything else, it decided, with COVID past, it was going to do what's called quantitative tightening. So it was going to sell the bonds that it had bought. It was going to sell the gilts that it had printed the money to buy. And it advertised that it was going to sell these gilts starting on a certain day. And the day that it was going to sell those gilts was on the Wednesday and the Thursday, the 2 days before Kwarteng's emergency budget on the Friday. So if you actually look at a chart of rising gilt yields, they were rising. They'd already spiked before the Kwarteng budget. Now, the problem with that Kwarteng budget, by the way, is while I supported every single tax cut they made, they were also increasing spending because of the fuel, subsidising people's fuel bills. So the problem with that budget is that it wasn't balanced. They were cutting taxes on the one hand and not reducing spending on the other. So that was the mistake they made. But nevertheless, Kwarteng got totally blamed for spiking government gilt yields. But the reason that yields spiked was that the Bank of England was started selling gilts the day before or 2 days before, when for over a decade it had been a net buyer. So and they advertised the sale to the market in exactly the way they advertised the sale with the gold price, and nobody reported on it. And it's just such a misunderstanding. And unfortunately, the unfortunate consequence of that is that it made tax cuts political suicide for a generation.
Yeah,
and that's an awful thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure the Bank of England people would have something different to say, but yeah, I mean, I understood it, like I say, at the time, the gilt yields, I learnt it all, but then I forgot it all again. But see, I know people at the Bank of England, and
it's like if you buy a gilt, so let's say I lend you 100 quid, and you have to pay me 5% on that 100 quid. So if I lend you 100 quid, we have what's called a bond. That debt is a bond. And you pay me 5% on the 100 quid that I lend you, like a bank would pay you 100 quid if you leave it in the bank. But then I can then take that bond that I've sold you, and I can go and sell it on to someone else. And I say, look, I've got this bond that yields 5%. But if suddenly the interest rate goes up to 6%, and I've got a bond that only yields 5%, the value of that bond will go down a lot. And so that's effectively what happened in the gilt market. Hopefully that makes sense, but I'm looking
the Bank
at
of England as well. They had
on your face and thinking.
Yeah, well, it's not my area of expertise, but if I study for a few hours after this podcast, I'll get it again. But but I do understand that the Bank of England, because I speak to people there, because I live in North London, so I know all the extended blob, and they always say they've got this motto. I can't remember exactly, but it's a kind of their version of the Hippocratic Oath. It's like, our job is to keep stability and all these kind of things. So I suppose that's just fundamentally at odds with a sort of libertarian Thatcherite growth mindset, isn't it? I mean, can you really even have a Bank of England and have growth? I mean, I know they have to regulate the economy, but would you even have a Bank of England?
No.
Of course you wouldn't.
No, we'd use independent money. We'd use gold and Bitcoin. We don't need central banking. Fiat money is the single biggest evil in all of this. And why should 12 blokes sat round a table decide the price of money? Surely, they don't set the price of bananas, so why should they set the price of money? The market can set the price of money perfectly well. And if the market had set the price of money would have been much higher for much longer, and we never would have had this ridiculously unaffordable housing market that we have.
Yeah, so it's a massive topic, but do you think crypto is the alternative to centralized current digital currencies and all that kind of thing, and fiat money? Do you think it's actually going to work as well? Because with my very layman's understanding, I see a sort of war between these centralized currencies that you kind of mainstream politicians want versus Bitcoin and other cryptos that they can't really meddle with. I don't know. Is crypto going to win? Is it going to survive, or are they going to take over with their own digital currency or something?
Bitcoin is the only thing that can save us. I specifically say Bitcoin rather than crypto. And there's a saying amongst Bitcoiners: Bitcoin fixes this. And we all argue that the fundamental evil in all of this is fiat money, and Bitcoin enables people to opt out peacefully. And it is attracting more and more capital, and the more people that start saving in Bitcoin than start saving in pounds and dollars, and the more people that start transacting, the more capital it will attract, and the less likely the fiat system can be propped up. And
because obviously people in these institutions have an agenda, but I noticed even up till quite recently when I spoke to them, they'd say things like, "Oh, it's for drug dealers and criminals." You're thinking like, it's ridiculous. It's obviously far beyond that. But
if you think, they're just smearing it in the same way that they smear their ideological enemies. But it is a most brilliant technological invention. It is backed by extraordinary amounts of computer power, and it has been a life for people in like Turkey and Venezuela and Argentina. It has been a lifeline. It has saved them because there's no functioning money system in those places, and it's the one thing that like I wrote a piece the other day on my Substack, which you should all read. It's called The Flying Frisbee. But there will not be a revolution. And in the old days, you could either rise up and overthrow the regime, but that option isn't open to us anymore because we're unarmed and the state is armed and there's too big a mismatch. Or you could withhold taxes and starve the monster that way. But you can't withhold taxes because almost all taxes are deducted at source. You can't go into a petrol station and go, I want to buy 10 gallons of petrol, and by the way, I'm withholding taxes. You can't do it. You can't go to the pub and have a pint of beer, but I'm withholding taxes. You can't, if you've got a job, your income is deducted at source unless you're a freelancer. So it's just impossible to withhold taxes. So the two options, rising up and overthrowing the regime, or withholding taxes, neither is open to us, and therefore there cannot be a revolution. But if you starve the monster of capital by using Bitcoin, then that is a third peaceful option.
Very interesting. And I did read the piece, and actually I've got some quotes from it I was going to ask you about in a minute. So yeah, Flying Frisbee, one of the best Substacks, as I said. But so this is really interesting. But so to an absolute layman like me, is the problem that China and whoever will come up with their own digital currency and they'll try and somehow displace Bitcoin? Then we have the cashless society, and we'll be trapped using their currency. And
it doesn't make any difference.
Okay.
If China issues its own currency, like it'll just be a national currency, whereas Bitcoin is an international currency. And if you just look at the scalability of it, there's a limit to how big the pound can grow, and that limit is the UK. And even the US dollar, which is the international reserve currency, there's a limit to how big it can grow. And it's very hard to open a US dollar bank account, particularly if you're not American. And then, and if you're some dude in Africa who doesn't have access to basic financial services, how are you supposed to use the US dollar? Whereas Bitcoin, all you need to use it is to transact in it is a smartphone. And now, I think in a global population of 7.5 billion, there's now something like 7 billion smartphone users. More people have a smartphone than have a toilet. And all they need to start transacting in Bitcoin is a phone. And Bitcoin's divisible to 8 decimal places. And so the Satoshi, which is an nth of a penny, the lowest denomination, that's likely to become the sort of default tipping thing, the default air mile of the internet. And Bitcoin has the potential to be the cash system, the default cash system for the internet. And the internet is 7-8 billion people. It's not 350 million people in America or 65 million people in the UK. So there's just a scalability to Bitcoin that no national currency can have. The one way a national currency could possibly compete is were they to back their currency, were they to back their CBDCs with gold. But that's extremely unlikely to happen. China might do it in order to try and compete with the dollar, but it's unlikely.
So how will they try and stop it? Inevitably, they're threatened by Bitcoin. But what will they do to stop it?
I think it's too late. They had their chance years ago and they didn't realize what it was. But you know, there's like this anti-Bitcoin faction in the US, and it's kind of led by Elizabeth Warren, and they all go, "Oh, Bitcoin uses lots of energy, therefore it's bad for the environment, green." But the anti-Bitcoin arguments are really, really incoherent. And you watch, like, Bitcoin is like a religion, and it's full of the most intelligent people in the world, motivated, intelligent, whether it's lawyers or computer programmers or coders or philosophers. It's full of amazing people. And it's like, you look at all the memes that come out of Bitcoin, they're so irreverent and anti-authoritarian. And anyone who attacks Bitcoin, they're like Michael Saylor calls them, what does he call them? What are those things like wasps?
Hornets.
Hornets, cyber hornets, he calls them. And anyone who attacks Bitcoin, this swarm of hornets, like, they debunk the argument. The intellectuals will debunk the argument, and the piss takers will make funny memes and take the piss. And it's such a coherent force, and yet it's totally unplanned and unregulated and unstructured. It's totally born of the free market, and so. And you know, they can ban crypto mining in America. Fine, crypto mining will just move somewhere else. But then America will lose out on all that investment. But then America's a very orientated around suing. If they try to ban, Bitcoin mining is all centered in Texas, and Texas likes the industry that comes from Bitcoin mining. It earns fortunes out of it. So if Elizabeth Warren will try and make it illegal, Texas will just go, no, we don't want it be illegal. You can make it illegal in wherever you're from if you want, but we're keeping it legal in Texas because we think it's a force for good. And so it's just, in practical terms, to make it illegal will be very hard to do. And if they do make it illegal, it's succeeded.
All right. Some good news for once on the podcast. But what about these people like Peter Schiff, who are sort of the gold bugs?
He's just wrong. Peter Schiff is a god. He's so articulate about inflation and money printing and Austrian economics and all that stuff. But he is just wrong about Bitcoin, and has been wrong for 10 years, 15 years now. And he's just wedded to his position, and he probably gets loads of clicks. Like, he's an old school gold bug. And I used to go to Bitcoin conferences back in the day, and I'd be the oldest guy at the Bitcoin conference and the youngest guy at the gold conference. And the old gold bugs, Bitcoin has done everything that they thought gold and silver were going to do, and they've never forgiven it. But it's a generational thing, and that's the other thing people don't appreciate about Bitcoin is everyone who is in the space is young, and it's the future. And if you've got kids and you're thinking, what are my kids going to do? Go and work in crypto, because that's where the opportunity is.
Right. And so people like Schiff, they basically think it's a bubble still. It's not a realistic...
He's just wrong.
Yeah. People won't actually use it, so therefore it can only be a bubble, all that kind of thing.
But like, people give it to him. They say, here's some Bitcoin, use it. And he just refuses. He's like, I really like Bitcoin, Peter Schiff, but he's just totally wedded to his position on that. And it kind of suits brand Schiff to be the anti-Bitcoin guy, because he becomes the figurehead of all their mockery. And every time the Bitcoin price goes up, people start posting pictures of Peter Schiff when he looked really young, and then pictures of Peter Schiff when he looked really old, and go, look what happened since Peter Schiff started shorting Bitcoin.
That's funny. Well, I was following it all a lot at one point when I thought I could make money from it. I do have a little bit of Bitcoin, but not a significant amount. I'm just going to keep it.
You're having a good time of it the last year or two. I imagine you're making a tiny bit of money, a little bit of money. Keep some of your savings in Bitcoin as a matter of discipline. Keep 5% or 10% of your savings in Bitcoin.
Because I'm a bit of a boomer, Dominic, my worry is, like, I've got this little bit of Bitcoin. One day it'll suddenly spike massively, but then I won't even be able to get rid of it. I won't understand the tech, or I won't be able to sell it. You know what I mean? Like, I'll just have kept it because I don't understand it well enough. I just thought I'll buy it now because I know it. I bought it actually reasonably low. What's it at now? I actually bought it reasonably low.
It's about $27,000, £22,000.
Okay, I bought about 5,000. So I didn't buy becoming a billionaire. I bought the sort of, but it's still reasonably low.
Quadrupled your money. I mean, what other investment could you do that with over the last few years?
Yeah, my only problem was I didn't have enough money at the time to make a sizable investment. That's the only slight bummer.
Well, that's you and your comedian's way of thinking. Most people would be happy if they quadrupled their money, but you're finding negatives in the positive.
Yeah, I can always do that. All right, well, that was really interesting on Bitcoin. But you mentioned your article then. I actually quoted. I printed out a quote from it because I'd read the article and I listened to you. Because one great thing about Dominic's Substack, by the way, is that he reads it out as well. And you even read that one walking down a beach in Miami, which was very cool. And because I always ask on this podcast, is the country finished? Is one of my obsessions, and we've talked about it privately. And you sort of address it in this piece. And you say, at school we learnt about dramatic irony. When the audience sees what the characters in the play don't, that's how I feel when I watch what Western Europe is careering towards. From energy to fiat money to mass immigration, we don't seem to realise what we are doing to ourselves, nor what the long-term consequences of some of these decisions, if you can call them that, are going to be. And then later in the piece you say, I suggest that pretty much that everything that isn't working has some kind of state action at its heart, yet the solution always seems to be more state. When will people realise that the state itself is the problem? So we've touched on that quite a lot, but this question of whether the country's finished, do you think it's finished, and is there anything we can do about it? You sort of said we can't because we're stuck with these, we can't rebel, we can't. You may have already answered this, we can't rebel anymore because we're sort of tied into the system.
Well, you can rebel, but you can't have a proper revolution.
Yeah.
Like occasionally somebody will post on Twitter, like, the streets of England in the 1960s. And, you'll be on a drive through London in the 1960s or the 1930s or whatever it is, or even the 70s. And the England or the Britain that we had then has gone. And we're never going to get that back. And if you look at, the census, the latest census figures came out a few months ago and everyone got their knickers in a twist. But I don't believe those census figures are accurate because I think a lot of immigrants don't realise what a census is, and they're illegal ones that are risking their own skin by filling in the census accurately. What gives you a much clearer idea of where immigration has gone is if you look at the demographics of primary schools. And if you look at the demographics of primary schools, they will be the demographics of the country in 30 years. And I haven't got the figures to hand, but I think it was, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like white English minority in primary schools by the early 2030s. And I just think that is a most profound, if the people have changed, then the country inevitably will change. And, my own daughter, I've got two daughters, but my eldest daughter, she's 20 years old and she's lived with me and she's mixed race. And I talked to her about English history and it is literally white man bad. There's no pride in English history. It's just all shame. And she started going, white people have never been persecuted the other day. And I was going, what? And then she said, yeah, white people have never been slaves. And I was going, do you realise what the etymology of the word slave is?
Yeah, Slav.
Exactly, Slav. And then this thing about why, the Arabs were massive slave traders, but there's very few black people in Arab societies in the same way there are lots of black people in post-slavery America. And the reason there were very few black people in Arab societies, the Arabs castrated all their slaves. Now, so who's the more inhumane one here? The one who castrated the slaves or the ones who didn't? So, we're so mistaught about stuff. And, the English, we were the first country in human history to make slavery illegal. And we then allocated 3% of GDP, which is more than we allocate to the military today. 3% of GDP at a time when people are much poorer. And numerous Victorians at great risk to their lives went to sea to put an end to the slave trade. And that is an extraordinary thing that the English did and something to be proud of, really proud of. The first, everyone's guilty about the empire. If you look at every other empire in history, the British Empire was about as good as it gets. And, of course, it's not black and white and there's evil and it's always more nuanced. But we were the first country in history to put a stop to it. And yet somehow our history is something to be ashamed of and not to be proud of. And so what they're teaching kids about ourselves is, and there'll be a backlash, there's already a backlash, but like if I'm talking like this and my own daughter thinks that like that, you get an idea of how widespread the misinformation is. So the other thing is, like, I look at history, and for me, my dad always used to say there was no golden age. The golden age is just in your imagination. But for me, if there was a golden age, it was like from maybe 1880 to 1910. That period then, it was just a period of extraordinary invention, innovation, wage growth, education. It was just a brilliant period. And you look at the great people that period produced, the great inventors, the great scientists, the great writers, and so on. And there's just no way that relative to the rest of the world, Britain can be the leading force that it was in that generation between 1880 and 1910. We're just so far away from that. And in many cases, we're trading off our past. And I was talking to a guy yesterday who's a big cheese raising money for a Qatari industry. And we were just discussing like how well the English are still perceived around the world, because the people around the rest of the world still think, the English gentleman, the elegant, the polite guy, the man you can trust, rule of law, fair play, all those principles that were associated with the English. My word is my bond, all that kind of stuff. But now we are exporting through the civil service and the foreign offices and so on. Like, we'll send a very, I don't know, he actually used this example, so I can't cite it, but to countries where homosexuality is not perceived in the same way that it is here, we'll send like a very gay diplomat or something. Now, you might say, well, that's sending out an important message, or you could say it's rude, or you could say, in my point of view, it's not necessary, because we have equality here, and you want to send out a diplomat who's going to get your country the best deals in the place that he goes to, not someone who's going to fall out with everyone. But we're sort of exporting woke, if you like, and it's going to change the way that we're perceived abroad. And we don't realize what we've done, and it's going to be very hard to go back, even 10 years.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Carl Benjamin made the point in one of his speeches that he was somewhere else. He was in Europe or America, I can't remember. And every nation that was mentioned had some negative and some negative connotation, even the European nations, except England. And no one had a problem with them. And we did have this incredible reputation despite the empire, or in some ways because of it. You're right, and it's such a tragedy that we've fallen into this self-loathing. Yeah, and on the slave thing, I mean, Spanish Muslims in 9th century AD is where this Slav slave thing comes from. So yeah, they could just as easily be teaching that. We never hear that. And
Barbary. What about the Barbary slave trade? No, we never talked about the Barbary slave trade. And there's 1.2 Western Europeans stolen into slavery in North Africa. Who teaches you about that?
I know, and it's partly colonialism, but it's partly our importing of American values and their slavery, and we think that's our fault.
Actually, Nick, sorry to talk over you. That's 100% what it is. It's because the culture of America dominates the world, and so American music, American clothing, American everything, American food is hugely disproportionate relative to the rest of the world. So the fact that, for example, Mauritania only made slavery illegal in 1981, how can they have done that? Just nobody knows. And so my daughter's going, how come we only know, the transatlantic slave trade gets conflated with slavery. And obviously the transatlantic slave trade is part of slavery, but they are not one and the same thing. And they're still, look at... various countries in the Middle East, how they build a lot of the infrastructure there. It's pretty close to slavery, as close as it gets. I mean, I think some of them are paid, but they have their passports taken away from them and so on. And, and so my daughter goes, well, how come we don't hear about any of this? And I literally think it's just America. Because the slave trade is part of the transatlantic slave trade is part of American history. It just obliterates everything else. Even though if you were actually to tot up the numbers, they're incomparable.
Absolutely, and there's a further irony there that America is England's greatest achievement because we invented it, and now it imports its culture back to us because it's gone a bit wrong. But yeah, it's a very good point, and actually, and on the slavery point as well, if you want to wind up people in North London, you use Douglas Murray's line, when is Turkey going to apologise for the Ottoman Empire? That one gets you in a pickle, or they just look at you blankly. But yeah, it's tragic. So
we've not talked about the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
And that was enormous.
I know. It's mad. And we're the only ones that have to apologise and hate ourselves forever. I know, and the problem is we talk about this,
prisms,
but it's futile.
The prism through which you view the world.
Yeah, you're right. And given that, how do we... My other question I love to ask, how do we win this culture war, Dom? Or can it even be won, or is it just a sort of increasingly restrictive state? I keep hearing this phrase. We mentioned anarcho-capitalism. A phrase I keep hearing now on Twitter is anarcho-tyranny. And a great example was the Just Stop Oil guy we've just seen at the time of recording, where a normal, I think he was a builder or he was in construction or something. He was trying to get to work. He threw these Just Stop Oil idiots out the way. The police, who were literally standing around doing nothing, suddenly pounced on him. And what we have is this, people are saying it's anarcho-tyranny. It's where not only the criminals go unpunished, but good people doing the right thing are punished. And we arguably saw it with Daniel Penny in America with the Jordan Neely case. So you can't have a society like this. But
I'm afraid anarchy is a word that's just been conflated with other things. And the police will always complain about anarchists. And like anarchists are peaceful, whatever. And when the police say anarchists, they mean, as you say, what they're now calling anarcho-tyranny. So the word anarchy has been conflated to mean something that it no longer means.
Yeah.
But you're like, the zero patient in all of this. You know what I mean by zero patient?
Yeah. Patient zero. Wait, no, patient zero, like the first sort of your example, no?
Yeah. The like in a zombie film, the place where the virus started.
Yeah.
The first person to get the virus. And in the zombie film, they have to go and kill the zero patient either to get the antidote or to destroy the virus. The patient zero in all of this is, well, it's kind of two things, but they're together in the Venn diagram. Our system of money and our system of tax. And, for all the battles, the noble battles that are being waged over free speech and free this and free that, if you got rid of fiat, fiat enables the oxygen for all these stupid things to breathe. They're all products of the state one way or the other because they're all lobbying and getting some special favour from the state. Without the oxygen of fiat money, they would not be able to breathe. And so I often argue that if everyone put all their efforts, instead of going over the top and fighting for free speech and getting cancelled and all this, which are really, really important battles, but the ring that needs to be thrown into the fires of Mount Doom is fiat money. And the battles that are over free speech are the riders of Rohan, fighting orcs in close to Saruman's towers or whatever. But the one that really matters is Frodo in the ring and Mount Doom, and that is fiat money.
Very interesting. So that's how we win the culture. It goes all the way back to... I mean, you've got this background there, your book, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. So it's not surprising that you think fiat money and tax are the problems. But
you design a society the way you tax it.
Interesting. So what is the moment? So is Bitcoin the throwing of the ring back into the fires of Mount Doom or whatever it is, Sauron's thing, and it all ends? How is it done?
Bitcoin is the invention of a new and better ring.
Okay. So, but what do we do then, Dom, to win this culture war? Because we're not going to get rid of fiat money anytime soon.
Save in Bitcoin, use Bitcoin, carry on fighting your fight, and put your own house in order.
All right, pretty good answer. That's all you can do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Stand up straight, clean your room. Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's almost a perfect ending. I'm thinking we should probably end on that because that's such a big question. You've only got a few minutes.
I've only got a few minutes, so that's a perfect place to end. I'm happy to end there if you are.
Okay, it's a pity because there's so much else though. Like I didn't ask you about Brexit, lockdowns. There's so many other things. But
GB News. I know your listeners want to know about GB News.
oh
What
yeah, go
happened
on.
there?
Then we should address that quickly then and try and get me in trouble. So
We
they
don't
they,
talk.
they do always tweet me like, "When's Dom? Why is Dom taking off?" It is very sad that you're not on there. I mean, you were a great asset, I thought.
I was such a charming presenter. The viewers
Yeah.
loved me.
Yeah, you're a great presenter. So what are you doing now instead?
My Substack's really taken off, so that's taking up a lot of my attention. I've been writing some new songs, and I'm going to be releasing them shortly. I'm working on a new book about gold, history of gold, and I'm going to be taking a show about gold to the Edinburgh Festival. And between all of that, that's taking up all my time and effort.
So people should go to the Flying Frisbee Substack. And what is the link?
Flyingfrisbee.com.
Flyingfrisbee.com, and you do all sorts of articles. It's investment advice, but it's also just culture war type articles, and you sort of give dispatches from conferences, and you read stuff out. You have guests sometimes as well, I think now.
I do. I'm trying to do video content like you. I hosted a thing called the Virgin Podcast a long time ago, and it was extremely popular, but unfortunately it got cancelled because of an arsehole in the Guardian. And I used to do an investment podcast for years in the noughties, and I'm sort of trying to revive it because, as I'm sure you know and are discovering, it's such a good way to meet people. And those people who host podcasts where they're talking, whether it's Konstantin or Joe Rogan or whatever, they just have extraordinarily powerful networks. Because when you have a conversation with someone in a podcast, it's a heightened conversation. You get through much more than you would get in, an hour just in the pub or whatever. And so they have that, but they have that with different people, and they win their trust, and they're trusted and they're liked, and their networks are just really, like, Joe Rogan must have the most powerful network in the world.
Yeah, and that was where Constantine did better than me. I started that podcast with Francis 2016, but he was much better at the networking aspect, whereas I've been too shy and introverted. Also need to get my video sorted. The sun's lights come in and completely ruined my shot today. You've got a great shot for the video listeners. But yeah, we're getting there. We're starting again.
Constantine is a formidable intellect, and it's as a result of having all these podcasts, you have all these conversations over and over again, you just suddenly clarify your own thought, and you improve your ability to articulate thoughts, but you also clarify your own philosophy. And he's just so sure of who he is and what he thinks and why he thinks what it is, why he thinks what he does, that it just means that whenever he comes up against someone on Question Time, whatever it is, or like he did that speech at the Oxford Union, he just is so articulate about it, and he destroys the people he's arguing with. And so as a result, he gets, he's become a formidable intellect.
Although you're pretty smart yourself, Dom. You got a 136 on your IQ test. I got a 137. Wasn't the same test. Wasn't a standardized test. It's hilarious that I got a 137. I did this Mensa test once, got a 137. It wasn't the same test. I'm sure you'd beat me, but it's funny that I got 1 point more than you. What was your test?
I don't know. It was an online one. There was me, my dad, and my son, and we all did one. And I got 136. My son got 132. And my dad got 128. And I'm like, I'm never doing another IQ test again.
That's what I'm like. I'm like 137, not touching it.
I'll take that.
What? The economics is my Achilles heel, so that's where I just, then it falls apart. So I'm just very much
economics
towards
in IQ tests.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's true. That's probably why I got 137. But anyway, who cares about that? Well, definitely follow Dom on the Flying Frisbee. And what is your Twitter?
At Dominic Frisby.
At Dominic Frisby. Always useful to have your own name. And you've also got this musical. Do you want to quickly promote that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I totally forgot about that. The most important thing in my whole life, and I don't say that lightly, my whole professional life, and also to an extent my personal life, aside from family and kids and stuff, is that people listen to this podcast, this serialized podcast that I put together during the lockdown based on my dad's story, called Kisses on a Postcard. And we just won the silver, actually, in the New York Festivals Awards, which apparently is the radio equivalent of the Oscars. We won silver for Best Serialized Podcast. It's 10 episodes, roughly half an hour each episode, about two kids, the adventures of two kids who were evacuated from their home in London down to Cornwall in World War II. And if you just type into your podcast app, Kisses on a Postcard, you'll find it. And Yeah, I would love if you can put a link in the description or something, but I would love people to listen to that because it is very important to me, and I also think it's really good. And it will make you laugh,
absolutely.
It'll make you cry, and all the rest of it.
All right, Kisses on a Postcard. Check it out, guys. We'll put the link in the description, of course. And for the people watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on audio, give it a 5-star review. Tell a friend. We've got some more amazing guests coming up. And thanks to Dominic for doing the show.
Thank you, Nick.
Cheers, mate.